National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen in on a conversation between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin, and Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Dr. Farkas has been a longtime fixture in Washington, D.C., where she has served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, a Senior Senate staffer. She has served in a number of think tanks. She also has taught as a professor at Marine Corps University and ran unsuccessfully as a candidate for Congress in New York's 17th District. Dr. Farkas gives us a survey of the global environment and the retrenchment of freedom since about 2005. She then places this in the context of the Trump administration and concerns among some of America's allies and partners overseas as to whether we are seeing a retrenchment of democratic principles within America that mirrors some of the developments we've seen in other countries. Let's listen in on this discussion.
I'm Will Inboden, the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas, and honored to introduce today's guest for our fall webinar series. It is Dr. Evelyn Farkas, a longtime friend and professional colleague of mine. Evelyn brings some tremendous experience. She served for a number of years as a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Eurasia. And she has been with a number of prominent DC think tanks as well, and is widely regarded as one of our country's foremost foreign policy experts. She's also not one who hesitates to roll up her sleeves and dive into the political mix. She most recently was a candidate for Congress in a New York congressional district. Unfortunately, didn't come in first place in that race, but still was a very important part of the democratic process, and I know enjoyed the experience as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn. She's going to share about 20, 25 minutes of comments on today's theme of global politics in the era of Trump. So Evelyn, with that, I'm going to disappear from the screen for a minute, and it'll be over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Will, and thank you also to Elizabeth Dowdy for organizing all of this. I did run for Congress, and I'm going to touch on Russia in this talk, and I forgot to mention that the Russians actually interfered in my elections, but in a small way, and not in a way that actually determined that I would lose or win, obviously. So today, we named my talk Global Politics in the Era of Trump, and my original intent was to discuss the impact of Trump on global affairs, on U.S. interests, on our values, on our allies, our partners, our adversaries, and the international system. But as I thought about it, I realized Trump is not the driver of global politics per se. It's actually not the era of Trump. It's the era of the standoff between democracy and autocracy, between true democracies with strong civil societies, free market capitalism and rule of law, and autocracies with or without the veneer of elections, and of course, where rule of law does not protect their citizens and kleptocrats control the economy. It's also the era where we find out whether our international system of laws and institutions hold firm, or whether we fall back on the old, unstable 19th century sphere of influence system. So today, the United States, we Americans, and our democratic allies worldwide, we are in a standoff against autocratic dictators working to destroy our democracy and to thwart our domestic and international objectives. First and foremost among these adversaries, of course, is the Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin. Second comes the Chinese government, led by President Xi Jinping. Russia is our greatest immediate threat. The Kremlin is not satisfied solely by threatening our international interests. It also seeks a corrupt, weak, undemocratic America. Russia is no longer a status quo power. Moscow aims, as I said, a return to the 19th century sphere of influence, international disorder. We know from history that this alternative to the current international system leads to great power military competition, economic protectionism, and ultimately war. Russia would like nothing better than a United States uncoupled from the alliances that have brought us unprecedented economic, military, and diplomatic success. NATO, of course, our only operational security alliance, is in the sights of Putin's Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin have one main objective: to stay in power, to maintain their corrupt autocratic kleptocracy running Russia today. To achieve this objective, Putin has determined he must demonstrate to the Russian people that he is making Russia great again. Indeed, after Russia's economic growth tapered off in 2011, he has found it useful to distract Russians with military adventurism abroad. Putin seeks to reestablish a sphere of influence that includes the old territory of the Soviet space, but if he can get away with it, he would also like to exert influence over the former East Bloc in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Putin believes that the United States, the strongest diplomatic, economic, and military power in the world, continues to spread democracy, including to the Russian Federation. Therefore, Putin is determined to make America weak and unable and unwilling to support democracy for oppressed peoples. And this is, incidentally, what is at stake here in Venezuela and also in Syria. Another dimension, of course, is Putin's interest in strategic reach, and as I mentioned already, making sure that Russia has global influence. In order to achieve his objectives, Putin and his government have repeatedly violated international law, norms, and human rights. And this is going to read like a long laundry list. Russia invaded the neighboring Republic of Georgia in 2008 and continues to occupy 20% of its territory. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea and starting another war in another part of eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin has murdered a list of its enemies in other countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Ukraine, and likely the United States and Washington, D.C., and has actually used chemical and nuclear weapons in order to do so. Russian fighters shot down the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine in 2014, killing 298 innocent persons. Russia has interfered, as we know, in elections in Western and Eastern Europe and the United States, and continues, of course, to conduct this interference as well as related information operations aimed at sowing discord and division and eroding confidence in democracy, and I can't underline that more. Russian cyber actors have infiltrated our energy and water grids and have inserted malware to facilitate potential further attacks. This gets to the Russian concept of war. Russia has violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and several conventional arms control agreements. Its military continues to conduct unprofessional, risky air operations, buzzing U.S. and allied ships and aircraft. Russian military jets have encroached upon U.S., European, and Japanese airspace at levels not seen since the Cold War, necessitating defensive military maneuvers by our aircraft in response. And the Russian government and its forces have assisted the Syrian military in the deliberate bombing of innocent civilians, hospitals, and even a UN convoy. China seeks to co-opt rather than destroy the international order. Beijing is interested in beating the United States economically and politically in order to assert its sphere of influence and to protect itself from American interference or dominance. A weak United States provides an opportunity for China to take over leadership of international institutions. China, as we all know by now, has a long history of industrial espionage targeting the United States. And under President Xi, now president for life, China has pursued a more overt and aggressive nationalist foreign policy. China's military buildup and economic espionage threatens the freedom of navigation, the democracy of our allies and partners, and U.S. competitiveness. China would like to take leadership in the Asia-Pacific region and to rebalance the international order to emphasize non-intervention and the rights of sovereign states over those of citizens. To that end, China has unilaterally asserted control over the South China Sea through its military buildup on the contested rocks and shoals. The end result is that China can blockade at will an area where 1/3 of the world's trade passes. China has flouted international law when it has been convenient, as in the case of the 2016 International Tribunal decision regarding China's claims in the South China Sea, which determined against China's demarcation line and also determined in favor of the Philippines, where China had interfered with Philippine fishing and oil exploration. China simply declared it would ignore the decision. Nationalist China is also blatantly disregarding its political agreement with the United Kingdom and the people of Hong Kong, which would have allowed the people of Hong Kong to have their capitalist system and their political system for 50 years after the transfer of Hong Kong back to China. That would be up until 2047. The national security legislation passed last year, and the clampdown on Hong Kong have continued apace. China has yet to pay a price, but it will, it's almost inevitable, at least economically, if it succeeds in snuffing out what makes Hong Kong, Hong Kong. Beijing's military buildup is also aimed at eventually bringing about the unification of China and Taiwan through force or the threat of use of force. And finally, the repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province is a concern to democratic states committed to protecting human rights worldwide. Meanwhile, China still hopes to develop 5G communications networks in Europe, which would leave US allies more susceptible to Chinese espionage, sabotage, and blackmail. This comes on top of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects, which have put some countries in Africa, Latin America, and Europe into debt traps, beholden to Chinese entities for decades. A United States that is more internally focused and less interested in democracy at home or abroad certainly serves as an advantage to China. Meanwhile, the dictators in North Korea and Iran threaten us and our allies with nuclear weapons they can use for blackmail or to attack us militarily. This is how they try to ensure democracies will not try to force regime change on them. And of course, if they succeed in keeping their nuclear arsenals, they will also encourage their neighbors to respond with their own nuclear programs, increasing the danger to us all. And we see that in the Middle East, certainly. Venezuela's abusive government, shielded by Russia and China, violates the basic human rights of its citizens and threatens to destabilize the region. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad, aided by his allies, as I mentioned, Russia and Iran, has used chemical weapons repeatedly against his citizens and destabilized his neighborhood by waging war on his people. According to Freedom House, 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. Okay, we won the Cold War, but guess what? By 2019, we're in the 14th year of consecutive decline of freedom worldwide. Social trust and democratic integrity in many of the world's consolidated liberal democracies have been declining, aided by corruption and coordinated, inauthentic social media behavior. Coordinated, inauthentic social media behavior. We see that here as well. Once democratic states like Hungary are now, in effect, populist dictatorships. And that hits me hard since my family is actually originally from Hungary. My parents fled communist Hungary, only to see it become democratic and now, again, authoritarian. So authoritarian and corrupt actors are leveraging the opacity of the global financial system, the lack of a digital and social media oversight, and their substantial resource capabilities to undermine democratic policymaking and to cultivate extremist elements. And some examples of where these autocratic governments are cultivating extremist elements in other countries are, of course, Russian support for the Alternative for Germany in Germany, the right-wing party, their support for the nationalists in France, their support actually for the NRA and Trump in the United States. Enter Donald Trump. Okay, now I'm finally getting to Trump. He is a populist leader with authoritarian tendencies. He came with or because of his relationship and affinity for Vladimir Putin and other strong men, including Turkish President Erdogan. He has subsequently embraced North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Philippine leader Roberto Duterte. He campaigned on a platform of grievance and has governed tapping into fear, ratcheting up anger and division. He actively spreads disinformation, often parroting Kremlin propaganda, word for word. Domestically, Trump has worked aggressively to weaken democracy, challenging congressional power from everything to getting access to his tax returns to determining how U.S. Treasury funds are spent in disputes over his border wall and funding for Ukraine. He's welcomed intervention into U.S. elections in 2016, and last year it earned him the distinction of becoming impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. And we know that Russian interference continues today, also without him taking an assertive stance. Trump criticizes the press and uses inflammatory, violence-inducing language against members of the media. He defends racists and anti-Semites demonstrating in Charlottesville, He's used tear gas against peaceful demonstrators in Washington, D.C., and sent federal forces to Portland, where they actually contributed to the unrest rather than alleviating it. He is anti-immigrant, which is not necessarily undemocratic, but certainly, I would argue, un-American. He created and enforced a policy of family separations, where the United States government permanently created hundreds of orphans and violated the human and international rights of asylum seekers. He set out to destroy the nonpartisan expert state, the people and organs of government best equipped to stand up to lies, manipulation, and outright corruption. The Fifth Risk, a book by Michael Lewis, details how non-expert, often anti-science loyalists were dispatched by the White House to privatize the U.S. Weather Service and to oversee the nuclear arsenal at the U.S. Department of Energy. Globally, President Trump has been bitingly critical of international institutions like the United Nations, repeatedly slashing his budget proposal for the U.S. contribution to the UN General Fund. I will note, of course, that Congress has then reinstated it, so they have not taken his cuts. More recently, he attacked the World Health Organization, which, while far from performing perfectly, cannot be held responsible for President Trump's mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. This summer, while the WHO is still actively charged with managing the international response to the pandemic, President Trump declared that he's going to withdraw the United States from the WHO. The Trump team has also actively worked to cripple the World Trade Organization by refusing to agree to the appointment of experts to its arbitration panel, the key means of enforcing trade agreements. The Trump administration has also threatened to unilaterally increase U.S. tariffs. President Trump has railed at trade agreements and declared trade wars against our neighbors and closest allies, Mexico, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and the states of the European Union. He did so using national security as a rationale, which was a slap in the face of our closest allies. He took those actions while also declaring a serious trade war against China. Instead of using trade to unite us with our allies, finalizing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement Japanese Prime Minister Abe wanted very badly, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the so-called TTIP, with the European allies. Instead, he turned and rejected a potential position of strength dealing with China. We could have taken the opportunity of the combined GDP of the United States, the European Union, and Japan for $45.6 trillion in 2019 against Beijing's $22.5 trillion to exert pressure on Beijing, but we didn't do it. President Trump is on the record with his belief that the United States gets nothing from our alliances. Indeed, he believes we are simply stuck with the bill from NATO allies South Korea and Japan. He has threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO, our only operational collective security alliance, one that effectively contributes to deterring Russia from military aggression towards its members. He has eroded the deterrence embodied in the alliance with South Korea by repeatedly agreeing to halt joint exercises in order to mollify North Korea's leader in exchange for absolutely nothing. Indeed, the biggest foreign policy failures of the Trump administration are those involving global threats and requiring concerted global action. Those issues include addressing rapid and catastrophic impacts of climate change, halting the global COVID-19 pandemic, and those that may follow in its wake, meaning pandemics that may follow in its wake, and of course the hardy perennials countering proliferation and terrorism. The United States produces only 15% of global emissions, yet we suffer the impact of our collective human failure to address the threat posed by the increase in fossil fuel emissions and the temperature of the earth. We can only address this problem with other nations, and U.S. leadership was the prerequisite to getting the limited progress we made in the signing of the Paris Climate Accords. Likewise, on arresting the danger posed by nuclear weapons. When Donald Trump entered office, the Iran deal was holding, and Tehran was years away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Today, can do so in a matter of months. North Korea had an estimated 14 to 48 nuclear weapons in 2016, and while President Trump did try to negotiate with the North Korean leadership, When Pyongyang, to try to get them to forfeit the program, when Pyongyang wouldn't relent to this maximalist goal, he gave up. And North Korea now has an estimated 20 to 60 nuclear bombs and a tested missile capability. Meanwhile, more Americans have died from the COVID-19 virus than all Americans who died in World War I and all Americans who have died since World War II in all military engagements plus 9/11. Instead of halting the spread of the virus, the United States has seen upticks, which are only now trending down for the most part. The world's nations responded by banning American visitors. It's no surprise then that other democracies look with alarm at what has transpired in America. The Dutch, for example, view the United States as only marginally less of a threat to them than China or Russia. And according to a recent Klingendale Foreign Affairs Barometer poll, 29% of them see the United States as a threat, as opposed to 35% for China and 36% for Russia. Again, that's a huge jump. 29% of the Dutch think the United States is a threat. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has talked about going it alone without the United States. America is clearly no longer leading its allies, but there's a worse potential future. Our allies fear that America will no longer remain democratic. Academics, as you probably all know, have churned out a raft of books in the last 4 years warning us of this peril. One of the clearest, most succinct, it's relatively short, is called How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They basically boil it down to 4 things. Democracies die when leaders do 4 things. 1, refuse to play by democratic rules. 2, delegitimize their opponents. 3, tolerate or encourage violence. And finally, prepare to curtail the civil rights of political opponents and the media. In the standoff between democracy and autocracy, autocracy has clearly made strides. But I'm an optimist, and this is not a foregone conclusion. It is not a foregone conclusion that autocracy will prevail over democracy. The recent election in Belarus, the resulting demonstrations, the so-called milk tea alliance among demonstrators in Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong are signs that the quest for democracy is universal and it won't be squelched. Indeed, political scientist Yasa Monk pointed out in last fall's Foreign Affairs that we shouldn't be pessimistic. He argued that in the case of populist dictatorships like Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela, and I would argue Russia, their legitimacy rests on the idea that they speak for the people. So when the inevitable internal or external crisis hits, it reduces the government's popularity. And in order to counter the loss of popularity or the dissent, the government then cracks down, which of course hurts its legitimacy. All the while, of course, these autocrats seek to discredit democracy, lest their citizens get any funny ideas. And that's why, in some ways, the existence of a democratic United States, even an isolationist democracy, is regarded as a threat to Russia, China, and other countries, other autocratic countries. And that's why, for us, democratic backsliding cannot be ignored, not when Russia works every day to cripple our society and politics. So there is much room for improving Donald Trump's foreign policy, starting with, of course, standing up to Russian election interference. But Americans can demand more. They will vote, but they must also actively participate in strengthening our democracy. We must work at home here in the United States to renew our vows to democracy. We must shore up our democracy and improve the processes and functioning of its institutions. We must ensure civility and democratic culture. We must fight corruption and improve our capitalist system to provide transparency, opportunity, and basic well-being for all Americans. We must require social media companies to govern themselves and to behave as print media companies. We must, as I said before, protect the integrity of our elections from cyber attacks and other manipulations, foreign and domestic. We must require, once again, that television and media companies provide equal time. And again, I can't underline this more. We must, as a society, preach and practice civility. And I now look forward to a very civil and constructive Q&A with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.